graduates visit for research opportunities in either the summer or even, I guess, virtual visit for research opportunities in the summer or during the year. And actually a couple of the results that I'll talk about today when we get near the end of the talk, we're done with kind of virtual visitors from abroad during the summertime this past summer. So it can be a very productive experience, even when you're not visiting in person. Okay, so with that said, I'll get started. Today's about the interface of learning and control. And, we're a small enough group that I really encourage you to treat this like a regular in-person seminar and interject and ask questions as we go along. Sorry, I just see a note saying, can everybody hear me? Yes?
Yes.
Okay, great.
Yes.
Okay, good. Thank you. Okay, so I think that I lost my train of thought a little bit there, but we're looking at the interface of learning and control, and this is a really exciting interface where I think over the last 2, 3, 4, 5 years, the potential of learning to control has really been recognized, and excitement has been growing when you not just in academia but in industry as well, when you see all the push towards autonomous vehicles and the debates that are raging between how much learning and how much control, how much you need model-driven versus model-free approaches in autonomous vehicles, in robotics, in drones, and then in things that like what I focus on and what my group focuses on, where we're talking about infrastructure systems like the grid, for example. And we think of managing the electricity grid, you clearly need a model-based, safety-critical sort of approach, but at the same time, there's huge benefits to be made by introducing model-free approaches from learning. And so how do you balance those things? And this has been a really exciting area, but realizing the potential that is talked about and waxed about poetically in these news articles is a challenge, and I think is more of a challenge than a lot of people initially realized. Predicted arrivals of things like fully autonomous vehicles have been promised, and those promises have long been broken. And we're on the second, third, fourth iteration of Tesla, for example, promising self-driving cars in the near future. And we'll see whether this is the time that they deliver, or if there's more unexpected challenges that remain. Because the one kind of predictable event in all of this is that spectacular failures upon deployment are just common and frequent. And whether this is autonomous vehicles crashing, or demos of robotics failing, or drones crashing, or blackouts when we think of power grid being driven by rare events that weren't well trained for in the training set that people were using for their model-free based approaches. And so, I think the potential has been, known and visible and exciting, but hard to achieve. And I think the reason is that we need scalable, trustworthy, predictable control, and we're just not there yet with learning-based tools. And so, as a result, there's, the excitement has driven a lot of people, like our group, to devote their, research to this, their effort to this in the last few years. And, a very impactful, rich field is emerging. I guess I should have updated this screenshot. The L4DC deadline for this year is this Friday. So, I know we're working on a paper for it. I think a lot of people are. And so this is, an exciting, very top tier conference with really interesting people, really interesting talks that's happening yearly now. There's more workshops than I can count within the last year on some sort of intersection between control and learning and optimization. And then, virtual talks like this one, there's been a group, including our group at CalTech and Ben Reck's group at Berkeley, and Ali Jabai at Princeton, or at MIT, and a number of other groups that have kind of gotten together and organized a weekly seminar series on control and learning that happens Wednesdays, just a little bit later than we are now, in case you're interested. But then the talks are also recorded and posted afterwards. So there's been a really nice collection of talks at the interface of learning and control happening there. And so, I'd say underlying all these things, all these workshops and conferences and talks, is the fact that, learning and control really mix well because of their complementary philosophies. And I've hit on this a little bit already, where you have, on the classical control side, the idea of going from model to action and mitigating uncertainty via feedback. Whereas on the learning side, you're kind of ignoring the model. You're going in a model-free way from data to action. And instead of mitigating uncertainty via feedback, you're mitigating uncertainty by learning from the past. And so, combining model-free and model-based, combining learning from the past with feedback as a way of controlling uncertainty, these are very complementary. And it's just very appealing to say, how can we go about looking for hybrids of these philosophies? And both have been successful individually, and the hope, the expectation is that we can really accomplish something significantly better than either individually by combining them. But it's unclear how to do that. It's unclear what the right combination is and how we go about that. And so there's been, I'd say, three themes that have emerged. This, of course, doesn't encompass everything and is biased by our own research at CalTech. But I think three important themes in this space are: how can you integrate predictions from machine learning into the feedback systems that you tend to use for control and autonomy? So, a concrete thing here would be, if you're thinking about something like model predictive control, how can you integrate machine learning predictions into MPC to be able to handle things that MPC can't handle typically traditionally, like time-varying environments, model error, delayed observations, things like that. So can you get power from these learning-based predictions? I think that's kind of usually the entry point for people, one of the first things that people think of as they start to play in this area. Maybe the next one that's sort of most optimal, and maybe the one that's received the most attention from people, especially coming from the learning side, is how can you use machine learning tools, often analytic tools, to improve the robustness and efficiency of control. And so this means, things like adversarial analysis, regret bounds, competitive ratio bounds, finite time single trajectory bounds, to be able to do things like improve the loss function, improve the cost functions that you can use in control, and get more robust bounds. So you improve robustness and efficiency by doing this adversarial analysis and seeing what that leads you to in terms of new algorithms. And then the most vague one, but probably the biggest goal, is how can you combine model-free and model-based to get the best of both worlds? And here, the way I like to think of it is, how much do you need to understand about the system to control it? You don't need to build a fully detailed model to be able to use it for control. Can you get away with kind of building in just a few crucial assumptions and exploiting those assumptions in a model-free way to get the power of control? And so, there's a lot of interesting questions around this, and I think the talk today will focus mainly on the first two, and then before I get to that, though, I want to say a little bit about the third one, because this is something that I'm really excited about, and we have 3 or 4 really new results in this space. And so this is work, I'd say, led by Guanan, who's a postdoc in our group. But Yiheng Lin actually started working on this while he was an undergraduate at Tsinghua, and he was working on a sort of virtual summer internship. And then Chen Kai also started working with this as an undergrad through a virtual internship. And so the first example I'll give of this is it possible to kind of exploit structure to make multi-agent RL scalable and tractable? Traditionally in multi-agent RL, you can't hope to prove anything. You can't hope to prove scalability results. But what we took as our motivation is things like smart grid, things like communication networks, where you have a network and there's locality in the network. There's a fact that, yes, somebody else's decisions impact you, but they impact you more if they're close to you in the network and less if they're far from you in the network. And that's an example of kind of a minimal model assumption. But just from that minimal modeling assumption, you can actually now provide provable results about convergence for multi-agent RL in scalable ways. And actually the approach here was to go through stochastic approximation, and as a result, the analysis that we did led to the first finite time analysis of Q-learning as well. And I guess didn't point out this figure, but this figure is an example of applying the tools in a wireless network setting, where we have a scalable actor-critic approach, and I'd say the benchmark for this area is Aloha, and you can really adapt to time-varying network environments and beat Aloha by quite a bit with this multi-agent RL approach. So that's one example of kind of model-free, model-based. So combine model-free with just a simple model assumption on the network locality and see what power you can get from that. Another example is very much control, where basically can you extend beyond LQR, linear quadratic, linear dynamical systems, control linear dynamical systems to nonlinear systems using model-free methods. And here the idea is, again, motivated by power systems. Suppose you have a linear approximation for your system, but your system is really nonlinear. But you have an approximation that's not terrible. Can you use the linear approximation as a starting point, sort of like a warm start for model-free methods, and therefore become much more data efficient? And so that's what this figure shows. The blue line would be the typical model-free approach, and it's highly unstable and variable. That's what the light blue is the sort of 95th percent confidence interval for it. The black line would be if you just use the linear approximation for your control, and the red line is what happens when you start from the linear approximation, but then use model-free approaches to improve. And you can see it's just much more data efficient, much more reliable, and much less variable in kind of convergence. So it's a big win, and beyond that, it's provably a big win. So we can actually get provably convergent policy, even though you're talking about nonlinear control, which I think is the first time a result like that is possible. And so those I think are good examples of what you can hope to do if you find ways to combine model-based and model-free. So I'm going to take a second now and just take a few questions if people have them. I see there's one that came in on the chat. Do we use algorithms like logistic regression and linear regression, or are they too trivial? That's a good question. Clearly, regression-based approaches are valuable. So not too trivial. They're valuable, but it's a little different than what I'm talking about here. Are there other questions right now that people have maybe about these two model-free, model-based things? You can just unmute and ask if you'd like. Okay, no problem. Okay, so then I'll go on to what is the main point of the talk, which is to look at these first two. And we're going to do this in the context of something that I've been working on for a while with my group, and that we're really excited about, which is the intersection of online optimization and control. And here, I'll just first start you off with a kind of sort of a cartoon for what I mean about online optimization. So the idea here in online optimization is you make a choice from an action space, you the learner makes a choice. And then in each round, the learner is presented with a convex cost function, C1 for round one. And then while observing that cost function, they're then making a choice for their action in that round. And then they pay a cost in that round of their action on the cost function, so C1 of X1. But then they additionally pay a switching cost for how much they moved to change their action, the cost of switching their action. And so in a given round, there's two costs: the hitting cost from the action itself and the switching cost from the movement in the action. And then you repeat this over and over. A new cost function comes, its minimizer is in a different place. Maybe you're greedy and you decide to move to nearby the minimizer. You incur that cost, you pay another switching cost. And then, another one comes, you choose a new action, and so on. And the challenge here is that without knowing the future, it's hard to know when to switch and when not to. And so, in this context, this green dot now, if you had known all the cost functions ahead of time, you could have moved to the green dot, which is kind of nearby the minimizer everywhere. Just pay a little cost, a little bit more than the minimizer everywhere. But by making one move there, you wouldn't have incurred all this extra switching cost bouncing around. And then, from there, but you couldn't have known to move to that green dot because you didn't know the future cost functions. Okay, and so the challenge is, how do you decide when to switch and how much to switch without knowing the future? And so summarizing it, you have cost functions arriving online. The cost functions are convex. You're choosing from a convex action space. And you have this switching cost, which you can think of as a norm, but in reality, it could be just any general function. And the goal here is to do well, at least our goal is to, when we're thinking about competitive policies, is to do well for the competitive ratio, which is the cost that your algorithm experiences over the cost of an offline optimal that knew all the cost functions, knew exactly what was coming. And we think of these cost functions as adversarial. So we're looking at the worst case possible of this competitive ratio, and that's what we want to minimize. And this is a little different than, I'd say, a classic learning measure, which is regret. So the most obvious difference is regret is additive and competitive ratio is multiplicative, but maybe the most important difference is classically regret looks at a different notion of optimal that you're comparing against. It looks at the best fixed choice. So instead of minimizing, offline over XT, you would minimize offline over a fixed policy X, rather than allowing your policy to change every time. And so it's a little bit weaker bar to compare against, and so you can compare against it additively. Of course, this is the classic notion of regret. There are also dynamic regret policies that would compare against broader classes, maybe dynamic policies with some restrictions on the form of the dynamic policy. But there's a lot of variations of regret. And for this talk, when I say regret, I mean this classical version where you're comparing to the best static optimal. And so, I want to emphasize one other contrast here compared to the classic learning model for online optimization. So the switching cost is different, but the other thing that is a little different, at least so far in what I'm describing, is we assume that the learner can view the cost function before making their action. And this actually isn't so important. If we go the other way, it's handleable, we can extend all the results. But by presenting it this way, I can emphasize that, the challenge here is not learning the cost function. Every round you're given the cost function. And so without the switching cost, if you were just had hidden costs, you would be optimal just by always optimizing the cost function in a given round. What makes this challenging is the switching cost couples the impact of your action today with the future. And so without knowing future cost functions, it's hard to know what to do today. It's impossible to know what to do optimally today. So this is a good point to, again, pause for questions if you have any about the model, because this will be the model that we talk about the rest of the talk.
Hello, Professor, can you hear me?
Yes, I can.
Yeah, I just wanted to ask, I think I missed the part. So can you explain why the switching cost is used? Like what's sort of what's
motivation? Yeah, I'll get to that next. I'll give you a whole bunch of examples as to why this is an important model. But right now it's just a math model, and then I'll motivate for you in a second.
Okay.
Excuse me, sir, can you hear me?
Aaron, yes.
So can you differentiate between offline optimum, static optimum, dynamic optimum, and if there's something as an online optimum?
Yes, certainly. Perfect. So the offline optimal is when we look at this equation as it's written, solve it knowing all of the cost functions. So suppose you know exactly the cost functions that are going to come. You solve that convex optimization problem for the trajectory x1, x2, x3 up to x capital T. The static optimal is as written, except you're picking a fixed x. So instead of allowing yourself to optimize over a trajectory of x, you're choosing a fixed action. And so this is, if you think of the k-experts problem, this is choosing a fixed expert that you're going to follow the whole time, as opposed to letting yourself follow a different expert each time step. And so that's kind of offline optimal versus static optimal. Online would be the best you could do without knowing the future C of T. In both this offline stat opt and static opt, you know the future C of T, you know all of them. The best online opt algorithm would be the best competitive ratio you can get without knowing the CT in the future. And we will have that come up later in the talk. So good question. Does that make it more clear?
Yes, sir.
Perfect. Okay, so then let's keep going. So why, I like the question a lot, why switching cost, why this model? So we got interested in this, nearly a decade ago or so at this point because of studying sustainable data centers. And the question we were interested in at that point was, can you run a data center on entirely renewable sources? And of course that seems impossible on the surface because wind and solar are so variable and they're not available all the time, and you have to do work when there is not wind, and so how could you handle that? This figure is just meant to emphasize the variability. This is one location near a data center in Northern California, and this is the wind on each line is a different day in a month at the same location, and so you can just see huge variability across days. And so how do you do this? Well, you have to dynamically adjust your capacity. You have to adjust when you run workloads to pay attention, so that things that have long deadlines, you get more flexibility and you defer when they're done. You have to use energy storage to account for the times when you don't have wind or solar available and schedule that energy storage very quickly. And it's a very complex problem, but at its core, the challenge comes because you need predictions of future wind and solar and energy prices, but switching is costly because when you switch a server off, the cost you experience from that is about the same as running the server for 2 to 3 hours. So to be willing to switch it off, you have to be willing to know that you're going to leave it off for 2 to 3 hours. And I guess when I say off, I just mean into like a deep power saving mode, so that the cost here is in terms of wear and tear. Every time you do that, the server could not come back, or the hardware could break in some way, and you could have some failure, and the likelihood of that increases the more you do it. And so that's the trade-off. And we spent a long time on this. We used algorithms like the ones that I'll talk about today to do this, and it turns out you can get a lot of the way there. We were able to, in an industry data center, reduce the grid usage by 80%, and the device here, the EcoPod that you see, was sold in large scale to a lot of Apple and Google and Microsoft data centers. And the core of our algorithmic work there was really this model, this smooth online convex optimization model, which is now being used in lots of other energy problems as well, from EV charging, where we have an actual garage at CalTech that is running its dynamic adaptive charging algorithms based on SOCO models. And actually those algorithms were the basis of a startup that was just acquired, that was run by Stephen Lowe, who's a faculty in our department. And so there's been a lot of work in a lot of different contexts in energy, but it's not just energy. So some exciting ones outside of energy that have ties to CalTech are, I think, things you might not think of. So, the one on the left is facial animation, specifically animating the mouth of cartoon characters. And this was partnership between Yi Sung-yu, who is there, in this part, and Disney, where the idea here is the hitting cost, the cost per round, is the shape of the mouth corresponding to how different that is from the shape that would make the sound that you can predict. So that the mouth needs to be in a certain shape to make a certain sound. So when you're animating, you want the mouth to look as close to that shape as possible for the sound that's coming out at that time. But you also can't have it jerkily move from one shape to another. You have to have that happen smoothly between. So the switching cost enforces smoothness, and the hitting cost enforces tracking the correct mouth shape. Robotic planning was also with Disney, and that's actually being used in NBA games, where you have a robotic camera operator. And for NBA, it's easy to kind of picture what it wants. You want the ball to be near the center of the screen for the performance of the user experience to be best, but you can't have the camera moving and following the ball precisely. And so the hitting cost makes sure that the ball is near the center of the screen at any given frame, but the switching cost ensures that the camera moves smoothly from one frame to the next. Video streaming is similar. Here, SOCO type algorithms are now embedded in standards, where now the switching cost comes from the cost to changing the rate, the streaming rate, which is a really bad, really negative user experience if the rate changes too quickly. But the hitting cost is the quality of the stream for a given rate. And so you want to adapt the rate to make sure your hitting cost is good, but you can't adapt it too frequently, and the switching cost enforces that. And then portfolio management is an obvious one. The transaction costs are the switching costs, and the performance of the portfolio is the hitting cost. And autonomous vehicles, especially drones, are a nice one. So here I'll use this as a little bit of a concrete example, because this is one that we're working on right now, where if you want to have a trajectory tracking for a drone, for simplicity, just think of the drone landing at a particular rate right now. Then the trajectory that you're tracking is this theta. Your position is the x. So one-dimensional right now, so just altitude. You're trying to land at a certain rate. And then you can't move too quickly, so the switching cost ensures that you don't move too quickly, so that you don't have the instability that comes from that. And so the switching cost, again, make sure that you're moving smoothly, but that you also are tracking the trajectory as close as possible while moving smoothly. And so tons of variations of the model, tons of applications means tons of variations. And so you can think of lots of different hitting costs, lots of different switching costs, lots of different constraints that people care about. There's lots of papers on all of the variations that I have on the screen. But in terms of the context of this talk, where we want to talk about control, there's a big missing piece, which is there's no dynamics in what I've described. So if we want to do control, we need dynamics, and there's no dynamics in SOCO. So how is this connected to control? And just to make that concrete, like if we think of that drone tracking problem, you're not really able to control the position just by saying, be in this position. You're controlling the position by having dynamics over your acceleration that change your position. And so the controller, here U, is impacting your position X in terms of via these dynamics, and then you have the cost on top. And so there's this, position that SOCO assumes you would control directly, but in control, you're controlling it through dynamics. And that adds an extra complexity. And so, more generally than that, drone example, here would be, a classical linear dynamical system where you have your control, your U, impacting your position via X, and then your state, I guess I should say, in the control, your state via X, and then your cost as a function of your control cost and your action position. And so your control cost here is what's mapping to your switching cost in the SOCO problem. But it's not clear how that mapping works. It's just superficial right now. And, over the last 2 to 3 years, we've been really kind of working on trying to understand what that connection actually is. So there's been a lot of work by, Alad Hassan's group at Princeton, our group, and many other groups as well, where the observation is a lot of the same algorithmic ideas, a lot of the same tools and techniques that are used in SOCO are also can also be used in control of linear dynamical systems. But starting with this work by Gautam, who's a student in our group, and me, and then building over the last few years, we've been able to make it more than just the tools and techniques work across both, but we can actually prove a reduction between them. And so these two papers, this first one is going to appear in NERP this December, and this is one that's under preparation that we'll post on the archive soon, where we can actually prove that any linear dynamical system with the matrices A and B in canonical form is equivalent to a SOCO problem, where the SOCO problem is a little bit different than what I just described. It has two additional complexities, memory and delay, where memory, what I mean by that is that the switching cost depends not just on the previous time step, but on the k previous time steps. So you have longer memory in your cost. And delay, meaning that you don't get to observe the cost function right away, but you get to observe it after d time steps. And so Memory has been interesting in SOCO for a while and was first used by Hilal Hassan's group, and it has importance beyond control. But here, it's really crucial for getting control into the picture. And so I'll just kind of give you the highlight here. So delay, what I mean specifically is that your hitting cost is parameterized by, say, the minimizer, and you don't get to observe the minimizer, so you don't get to observe the parameter of the hitting cost until k steps later. And then for switching cost, you're, instead of having that norm of xt minus 1, you now have something that depends on xt all the way back to xt minus p. And in particular, in the reduction, the form that we need is this linear combination, where your switching cost is kind of a linear combination of the previous p states or actions. So that's what I mean by memory and delay. And in the control context, memory, at least in our reduction, memory is connected to disturbances on the input, and delay is what lets you capture disturbances on the state. And so, of course, you can have disturbances based on either in control, and so you need both to be able to handle general control problems. But this is a nice distinction, as we'll see later, because it's harder to handle delay than it is to handle memory, and so that has a nice input in insight for the control context. Okay, so that's an intro on online optimization and how it connects to control. Are there any questions at this point? The cost function, so think of it as a completely adversarial model that I'm talking about. So there's an adversary who's going to give you your cost functions, and we're going to try to prove bounds even in the context of an adversary. Now you can also ask a lot of the questions that I'll ask coming up in stochastic models, where you have some predictions or some model assumptions about what the cost functions how the cost functions will come. But all the results I'll give are kind of robustness focused, so they're all adversarial.
Hello.
That's a good lead into the next thing. But yeah, Aaron, go.
I think there's a bit too focused into one particular research. I saw that you mentioned Professor Chung's. Professor Chung is involved in this work. So can you explain how this relates to aerospace robotics and?
Sure. So the example here is let's see. Actually, I have a figure later on, I think, that I can show you. But this model is a sort of clean example here. So this is a simple model of physical tracking, but this is dynamics that you would implement for drone tracking, right? So you have an autonomous drone, you want it to track a particular trajectory, maybe follow another drone around, or just follow a path that you want. And the disturbances here are coming from, say, wind gusts or interactions with other things in the air, they're dynamic impacts. And so you have uncertainty around those disturbances. How do you do that kind of trajectory tracking? And through the reduction I just described, you can do that just by giving, if I give you an online convex optimization algorithm that has a good guarantee, it will off the shelf have a adversarially robust guarantee for trajectory tracking with a drone.
Yes, sir. So one thing I didn't understand is, let's say we take the situation of a drone. So we would prefer that this is done on the go instead of getting all the data at once after calculating. So how is this done on the go? If I understood right?
Yeah, everything here is on the go. So everything here is you make a decision without knowing anything about the future. And so this is completely online. Let's get into the actual details. Everything's been a little bit overviewed now. So hopefully in the next little bit, the model will become a little more clear. So we'll start by ignoring memory delay, and I'll give you just an example here of what to think of. So think of a very simple case where you have the adversary can choose one of two cost functions to throw at you. So every given round, the adversary is going to either give you a linearly decreasing or a linear increasing cost. And from that linear decreasing or linear increasing cost, you're going to make a decision, and you don't know anything about what's going to come in the future. What should you do? So, the first natural attempt and what a lot of people do, say, an MPC type approach without predictions would be a greedy one, where you always optimize given what you know. And so if you always optimize given what you know, that means whenever you get a, cost function C1, you're going to choose your action to be 1. Whenever you get cost function C2, you're going to choose your action to be 0. This is a bad idea because, what happens then is the adversary is going to give you an alternating sequence of cost functions. One decreasing, one increasing. And if the increasing one is shallow and the decreasing one is steep, then your cost on that instance, of course, you don't know what's coming. So you're making a decision just based on each one individually. But your cost is going to be order t because you're going to move back and forth, to 1 and then back from 1 to 0 to 1 and then back from 1 to 0. And you're always getting 0 when you're hitting cost, but you're always paying a switching cost. And so that's much worse than the optimal, which knowing what's going to happen would just always play action 1 and pay 0 whenever a C1 came and pay 1 whenever a C2 came. And no matter what sequence the adversary gives you, whether it's all C1, all C2, some weird mix between them, your cost is always going to be less than 1 with that. So you're always an order of magnitude better than what you could have done with greedy in the optimal. And so greedy is, a disaster in a worst case sense for robustness compared to, for this model. So, model predictive control, these sort of simple type things, they won't work here unless you have a lot of predictions without much information about the future, they can't work. And so you have to kind of be considering whether switching is worth it when you're making it. Another very natural thing to consider here would be gradient descent. So in gradient descent, if you get the C1, you're going to take a little step down. C2, you're going to take a little step down to the left. And so again, what would be a bad example for this algorithm? Well, you don't know what's coming in the future. And so when you get C2, you're going to take little steps down. But at some point, you're going to go past the crossover point. And so the adversary is going to give you the other cost function. And then you're going to take steps down, and you're going to end up bouncing back and forth over this upper envelope. And the adversary can kind of always force you to be paying cost on this upper envelope. Whereas the optimal, and that's a good thing in the sense that's the static optimal, but the optimal wouldn't be playing that at all. The optimal would be bouncing back and forth between these endpoints and paying 0 for long stretches of time and paying 1 for, and then switching over. And so the optimal would be, again, order t, order of optimal, order of magnitude better than gradient descent as long as these cost functions are steep. And so neither of these kind of classical approaches are going to work well because without knowing the future, an adversarial cost function can come and cause you to pay too much cost compared to the optimal. The optimal can do much better than you in these contexts. And so you need to, it's crucial to make big jumps if you want to do well compared to the offline optimal. And this gradient descent algorithm example is interesting because it highlights that there's a difference between doing well for regret, matching the static optimal, and doing well for competitive ratio, matching the offline optimal. For control, of course, you want to match the dynamic offline optimal. And for learning, sometimes the static optimal is enough. And we can actually formalize that and say there's no algorithm that can possibly be both sublinear for regret, which is the goal, and constant for competitive ratio. So you can only do well for one of these measures in the worst case. And in control context, what we care about is competitive ratio. Okay, let me pause again there. Does that make it a little more clear what's going on in the model and that everything's online? And so you don't know anything about the future and you're trying to make these decisions. So maybe it makes it a little more clear why this is 0. Go ahead, Aaron.
Yes, sir.
Oh, awesome, good. And usually, those are good examples, I think, and also for showing why it's hard, right? Why the simple approaches don't always work and can't work in a robust way. And so the big open question for a long time has been, can you be constant competitive for these algorithms? Can you do well compared to the offline optimal? And the first answer a long time ago, back in 2013 from our group was yes, but with a big caveat. within one dimension. So when the action space is one dimensional. And in that context, our first result here was that you can be 3 competitive. And then, there was a lot of work in the coming 5 years showing, 3 isn't the best you can do. You can be 2 competitive. 2 is the best possible, came in 2018. But those algorithms were very complex, matching the 2. And in general, you maybe want to be memoryless. You don't want to be using a computation that involves computing something over all of the previous actions and cost functions. You want to just use the current one and make a decision. And if you're just memoryless, if you're just using the current cost function, you can show that 3 is actually the best possible. And you can give memoryless algorithms that achieve it. And so a lot of work happened over 5 to 7 years on the one-dimensional case, but it was all one-dimensional. And really, this was a very frustrating thing. And I remember giving talks for years, ending with this is exciting, but all that I've mentioned is one-dimensional. What we really need is high-dimensional algorithms, and that problem is hard. And that's where the open work was. And so there was a long time, and basically nobody made progress on the high-dimensional case unless they used lots of perfect predictions. And finally, last year, it became clear why. So in a sequence of results, one from Sebastian Bubeck's group and one from ours, you could prove that there was a specific example of online optimization where you couldn't be constant competitive. Your competitive ratio was always going to grow with the dimensionality of the problem. And so high dimensional problems were necessarily hard. And our contribution here was to show that they're hard even if you give yourself predictions of the future. So even if you can perfectly forecast the next W cost functions or bodies in the convex body chasing problem, then you can't do well. You always have to have this root D lower bound where the D is the dimension of the problem. And the convex body chasing problem is a really interesting, important problem. And so I want to show you it here. Again, a simple cartoon example can make it very clear what it is. So you're a learner, you're choosing an action here from a 2-dimensional action space. And each round, instead of being given a cost function, you're now given a convex body, and you have to be in the body. There's no hitting cost anymore. You just have to choose an action that's in the body. And then your cost is just your movement cost, how far you move to get into the body. And so then the next round you get a body, you move to get in the body, you pay that cost. Next round you get a new body, you move to get in the body, you pay that cost. And just like in online optimization, if you knew what bodies were come, you could be really smart, and in this case, choose one that was in all the bodies and just have one small movement. But because you don't know that, you're kind of at the, you have this really challenging problem of deciding where in the body to move to. And so it's a hard problem, a very similar one, and it's clear that it's kind of a special case of SOCO because you can just have a cost function that is 0 in the body and infinite outside the body. And this now becomes an online optimization problem. It's not as clear that you can go the other way, but you can. So if you have a problem an algorithm that can solve convex body chasing, you can actually use it to solve any SOCO instance. And the reduction there is a little bit less obvious, but still simple. So you take your cost function, you use it to define a body for each round. The thing that's a little bit surprising is in between rounds, you have to move down. You basically have to have a one-dimensional body that forces you to move down to an axis and then back up. And that gets you that kind of cost function going up that you need to capture SOCO. And so there's a reduction. Why I drew these pictures is because to make it obvious that though there's a reduction, it changes the dimensionality of the problem. And so you can take a convex body chasing algorithm for D-dimensional CBC and use it for D-1 dimensional SOCO. And that's important because when we ask what is known about algorithms for convex body chasing, the algorithms that existed were all for at most 2 dimensions, which means they were for 1-dimensional SOCO, which is the problem that we could solve. And so, at first glance, there wasn't much that you could gain from convex body chasing. But there was a huge amount of work in the last 5 years on this, mainly in the kind of stock Fox community, pushing these results from quite far. And the latest two results kind of tell the near final version of the story and give O of D algorithms that are quite beautiful, especially Mark Silk's result is a quite beautiful proof for how to get an O of D algorithm for this. And so there's still a gap, D to root D, but there's a lot of progress here. And this actually directly has impact for control, because there's a student at CalTech, Dimitar Ho, who has a recent paper. It's not on the archive yet, but it will be soon, where if you look at nested convex body chasing, so the body chasing problem where you have your bodies and they're always shrinking. So it's not like the picture I showed where they move around randomly, but the next body is always a subset of the current body. Then you can use the nested body chase problem actually for robust nonlinear control in a quite interesting way. But for our perspective, we need to be able to solve the SOCO problem. And the implication of the results for convex body chasing are in some sense negative, that we can't hope to be constant competitive and get really good guarantees if we're looking at body chasing. So if we're looking at the whole class of SOCO, so we need to make some assumptions. And it's natural what to do. So this version of body chasing where you have this discontinuity and this really extreme difference between 0 and infinity, that's going to be really hard to deal with. But maybe if we add some smoothness or type assumptions, some well-behaved assumptions to the cost function, we can do better. And so that was our idea, and turns out that led to, I think, what was in our mind a very nice breakthrough where we can do well with a little structure. And here's our result from last year, where we can give an algorithm that is constant competitive. So 1 plus O of 1 over root M, where M is the strong convexity parameter for the hitting costs. And this works for lots of different switching costs, L2 or Bregman divergent switching costs. And the key thing here is this is very consistent with the body chasing results, because if M is really small, that means that the function is really flat around the minimizer, like the body chasing kind of cost functions would be. And then this is a very large competitive ratio, so you can't do well if your function is very flat near the minimizer. But if your function is well behaved, you can do very well and have a small constant competitive ratio. And so this is the result. And the exciting thing here was, again, no dependence on D. So even in very high dimensional problems, now you can get a very strong, robust competitive ratio. And not only that, if you ask what is achievable, are there lower bounds? The lower bounds match their order root M, and we could prove that. But even more than matching in order, you're able to prove that this is truly an optimal online algorithm. So its competitive ratio matches precisely up to constant factors the optimal competitive ratio that any online algorithm can achieve. And so this comes back to the question you were asking about what does it mean to be optimal for an online algorithm? It means to have matching competitive ratio, and this algorithm, regularized online balanced descent, ROBD, achieves that. Okay, and so what is ROBD then? Maybe before I say what ROBD is, I can take any questions there are about the results at this point. Okay, good. So, and I see that I'm running a little long, so I'll skip over a few things in a bit, but the algorithm here is the most important thing. So what is ROBD? So let's start with just online balanced descent. So here, I'll explain it in kind of a picture first. So think of the circles here as the level sets for your cost function CT. VT is the minimizer of the cost function. And so you're sitting out here in your previous step on some level set. If this were gradient descent, it would be clear what you would do. You would move in the orthogonal direction of the level set, according to whatever step size schedule you have, and that would be that. But I bring that up because it sort of highlights why gradient descent is bad for these problems. Because suppose you followed this step, you moved to this, you took this step, you landed on this level set, there would be something better you could have done. You could have done this. It would be on the same level set, so it would have the same hitting cost, but it would be a shorter move, so you would pay less cost in that round to end up on the same level set and have the same hitting cost. And so it would be better to, instead of moving orthogonally to where you are, move orthogonally to where you're going to land. So basically, follow the projection step instead of the gradient step. And this is the first big idea in the algorithm, which is, don't pay attention to the geometry where you are, pay attention to the geometry where you're going to land. And that's important because we care about movement costs, these switching costs, whereas gradient descent kind of is agnostic to those costs. So the first thing was, to do that, to project rather than move in the gradient direction. And the second is to choose the level set that you're going to land on in a way that balances hitting cost and movement cost. So you select the level set and then project onto it. That's the algorithm. And so in math, it's now up above, project onto a level set where the level set is, where the cost is less than a certain L, but choose that level set in a way that that hitting cost, that L, is balanced with how far you're moving to get there. And the balance parameter is beta, and everything's very robust to what the balance parameter choice is. And so that's the idea here. So it's kind of, a variation of gradient-like algorithms where you're making adaptive step sizes and you're choosing the direction based on the intermediate geometry of the cost function rather than the local geometry of the cost function. And this is, good, but not quite what I described. So this is online balance descent without the regularized piece. And the interesting thing is this is not good enough yet to get to that square root M dependence. This is only getting you to 2/3 M dependence. And so you need one other idea, and that other idea is to be a little bit more greedy than what I just described. And what I mean by greedy is after you do that projection onto the balanced level set, you then take a step directly towards the minimizer of the cost function. So not in the gradient direction, not projecting on anything, just directly towards the minimizer. And that step size depends on the curvature, the convexity of the cost function, that M parameter, but you take that step and that then gets you there. So now the whole algorithm is do the projection onto the balanced level set and then step towards the minimizer. And that's enough to get to that optimal competitive ratio that I described. But as I've described this so far, this seems computationally intensive because you have to search for the right level set, you then have to do a projection, and then you have to take this step. And so there's, this is not kind of computationally easy so far, but you can actually come up with a more simple computational view of this by looking at solving a regularized optimization in each time step of the following form. And I won't go into why this exactly works, but it's not too hard to see, that the first two terms correspond to kind of projecting onto a level set, and the last term is giving you this kind of greedy step via regularizer. And so this last optimization is what we call regularized online balance descent, and it's computationally easy. So you're just solving a convex optimization each step, and it's what gives you this optimal competitive ratio. So that's ROBD, and so we can be constant competitive, and I won't go into the details of it, but this extends to delay in memory. So with one extra idea to turn it into what we call optimistic ROBD, now all of a sudden you get, again, a dimension-free competitive ratio that's optimal for the case where you have delayed information about the cost functions and memory in your switching costs. And I won't go over that too much other than to say delay hurts a lot and memory isn't actually such a big deal. So in the control context, that means that input disturbances are somehow easier to handle in terms of this robust competitive ratio metric than state disturbances, which is, I think, a nice insight to draw from this. And, like I said, because of the reduction we have now, this now gives the first constant competitive policy for linear dynamical systems. And you can then get constant competitive results and competitive ratios for things like tracking problems, like the drone tracking problem I talked about earlier. And the interesting thing here, especially for the control case, is this is giving a guarantee in the case of adversarial disturbances that you're going to do as well as even the best nonlinear policy could have done. And so you're not even just comparing to the best linear policy, you're comparing to the best nonlinear, time-varying, adaptive policy that could have been used in this case of adversarial noise. So it's a very strong robustness guarantee you get via this, online optimization result and then the reduction to control from online optimization. And then given the time, I'm going to skip over the discussion of optimistic ROBD and just say that, not only do the results extend to delay in memory, they extend to non-convex costs and predictions. And there's a really cute extension as well that I want to highlight just in case people are interested to the case of distributed online optimization. So I told you about the reduction to control. There's a similar reduction to distributed optimization where if you take an online optimization algorithm with a certain competitive ratio, you then get a distributed local optimization algorithm with that same approximation ratio that achieves that approximation ratio with only log n messages, which is exponentially fewer messages than things like ADMM. And so, this is really exciting because you get a huge reduction in message complexity compared to standard distributed optimization. But it's, not a silver bullet because, you are stuck with that approximation ratio from the online optimization world. So you can't make it better. You could use it as a warm start for ADMM and to make it better. But alone, it gives you a particular approximation ratio that is, not optimal. But if that's good enough for the application, you achieve it with much less communication than with standard approaches for distributed optimization. So, I find this really exciting. And, if you're interested in that, you can ask me questions and follow up as well. But I will stop there and just say that, we're really excited about, this work in online optimization. There's been a huge progress over the last 5-7 years, not just on the theory, but also on applications of these. And I think, right now there's this moment where we're really just starting to understand the deep connection between online optimization and control. And I think there's going to be a lot of progress as we push that further in the coming years. There's going to be a lot of exciting results. So I'll stop there. All the results I talked about are distributed across these papers. I covered a lot of ground. So you can just follow up with me if you have specific questions about which results are from where and how they connect to various things. But I'll stop there for now. Thanks.
Hi, Professor.
Yes, go for it.
Yeah. So in the I don't exactly remember the name, but in the ROBD algorithm where you said we can do something more greedy. So how about why not just so effectively you end up at a point. So why not just take a bigger greedy sort of step? Like you take a bigger step in the greedy algorithm, and then you shift to the point which is perpendicular to that level set. So why
not take a bigger step and do that? Yeah, it's a little unclear. So let me give you a little bit of intuition as to why we came up with this. The only thing I can say about why not do something else is we are getting the optimal competitive ratio, so it's working well. But that's a little bit of a cheat because for any particular instance, maybe you can do better with something else. So why we did this is it's really about robustness. So if you think of the adversarial model here, the adversary is going to give you cost functions each round, and those can be chosen to hurt you given what your choice was. And so if you move too close to the minimizer, then it'll give you a cost function with a minimizer that's very far away, and the optimal offline will have known that was coming and will have not moved too close to the minimizer, and so you'll have paid too much of a switching cost. But if you're too far from the minimizer, then the adversary will move directly to the minimizer, and the next cost function will be really steep right around the minimizer, and you'll have to make a big jump to get there, and that'll hurt you. And so the way I think of the goal of the algorithms here is actually not so much to do well for hitting cost. You got to do good enough for hitting cost, but you have to make sure you're tracking the optimal trajectory well. So you're not too far from what the optimal will do for the optimal action, the offline optimal will do. And that means that you have to be not too far from V of t. And so if you pay too much attention to the geometry, you just might end up too far from V of t because the cost function is too shallow. And if you're too far from V of t, then the adversary is going to punish you. And so you're going to get a bad competitive ratio. And so you have to kind of track that optimal trajectory, even if cost difference isn't too high. So that's kind of the intuition here. And application-wise, this makes a lot of sense. Like most of the applications I talked about, they're in some sense trajectory tracking problems, where you're tracking either the optimal trajectory of a video streaming rate, or the optimal trajectory of a camera motion, or a drone motion. And so it's kind of keeping your trajectory close according to some measure is the goal. And this greedy step is chosen to do that. Like it does that well. Hopefully that helped.
Yeah, okay, thanks.
Excuse me, sir.
Yes, go for it.
So a bit later after this, when you explained about ROBD, after that you said that the delay remains high, but the memory is less. So can you explain on that? Because I didn't get a bit of how they're defined as well. I think.
Yeah, I was pretty quick on this. Sorry, the talk is a little longer than I intended it to be. So the delay is so think of it as you have delay K, I guess here, if I'm getting my parameters right. Delay K means that you see the cost function K steps after you choose an action for that round. So, in the tth round, you're making an action xt, you only see cost function ct at time t plus k. And so you don't get feedback right away. And this is really crucial in applications. So think of the drone case. You may not know exactly what's like the feedback for your position, the feedback for measurements about the environment around you until a little bit of delay because of sensor delay and computation delay and these sorts of things. And so that delay creates challenges. And so even without the reduction, delay is really an important factor. Memory is in the switching cost. You depend on not just xt minus 1, not just the previous step, but also xt minus 2, xt minus 3, xt minus 4, up to xt minus p. And so in this formula, k is delay. This alpha is capturing the impact of memory. And if you remember, these CI are it's a linear combination of your previous actions that was used in the reduction. So this is kind of saying how much weight is there from the memory in your switching cost. So alpha high means their memory has a high weight. And so if, when we look at this, K shows up here. So there's an exponential impact of delay. Alpha shows up here and here. So there's kind of a linear or, small order impact of memory in these things. And so memory certainly has an impact, but less than this exponential impact that delay has. And in a reduction, which I didn't give you the details of, we use delay to capture state disturbances, and we use memory to capture input disturbances. And so one interpretation of this theorem is to say that, if you have state disturbances, they're going to make it harder to be robust, harder to have a small competitive ratio. If you have input disturbances, they're going to certainly impact your robustness, but not nearly as much. And so input disturbances are in some sense easier to handle than state disturbances.
Yes, sir. Got it.
Good. Next, another question. I know it's late for everybody. I'm impressed that you've had this many questions. Okay, Perfect. So thank you so much. Thanks for staying up late and watching the talk. Please don't hesitate to send me an email if you have any questions or if you have ideas that you want to bounce off me, or just if you have work related that you want me to know about. I'd be happy to hear from you. Yeah. Happy talk, everybody. Okay, thank you.